Good evening, Wisdom class. Welcome to this idea called Flip Class. I hope this will be a benefit to you as that you can watch this in the comfort of your own home. And if you missed something or you didn't understand something, you can stop the video and rewind it. You can't do that in class with Mrs. Johnson. I don't have a remote where you can rewind me. So I hope this will help you. Also, if your parents want to watch these videos alongside you, they can, and see how Mrs. Johnson teaches in class. So let's get started. We're in the chapter 2 called Weathering and Erosion. Now before we get started in the lecture, if you see this lady, I want you to do what she says. I want you to read the pages that she says on her little card, pages 26 to 27. So stop the video, read those 2 pages, and then you can start the video again. Okay, in chapter 1 we talked about earthquakes and volcanoes, and we learned that earthquakes and volcanoes are just God's way of protecting the earth by releasing energy that is under the surface of the earth. When we learned about volcanoes, not only is it releasing energy, but it's releasing magma or lava. Now those 2 words are basically the same thing. They're melted rock. But magma is underneath the surface of the earth, and lava is when you see it. When that magma or lava cools, it forms different kinds of rock, depending on how fast it cools, and that is called igneous rock. This is an example of igneous rock. It's obsidian. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. We have 2 other kinds of rock that we'll talk about. First is the sedimentary rock. Now I want you to pay attention to this word sedimentary. The root word is sediment. Okay? And all sediment is tiny pieces of rock caused by weathering. And we'll get to that word weathering in just a minute. Alright, so little tiny pieces of rock called sediment. And that sediment gets gathered together because of erosion. And then over time, pressure compresses that sediment into rock, sedimentary rock. Then we have igneous rock, and then we have metamorphic rock. Now the word metamorphic comes from the word metamorphosis. We talked about this in Science 4, where you have a caterpillar that goes into a chrysalis stage, and then when it's into its adult stage, it's now a butterfly. It did a complete change of form, and that's all metamorphosis means. It means change in form. And so metamorphic, metamorphosis come from the same word. So what happens with metamorphic rock, it was once either sedimentary or igneous rock, and because of heat and pressure, it changed to a completely different rock. There are some examples of each rock. For instance, with sedimentary rock, we have sandstone, and this is the picture that is on my board. This is sandstone. We have limestone, shale, and calcite. All right. Under igneous rock, the one that is underlined is obsidian. It's this black, shiny rock that's kind of like glass, and it's shiny like glass or smooth like glass because of the way it cools. It doesn't have time to form those crystals like you see in this metamorphic rock. We have pumice, granite, and basalt under igneous. And granite and basalt are very, very, very strong rocks. They're used in construction or making a building or carving out statues. They're very, very strong. They resist weathering or the breaking down of rock. And the last one, metamorphic. All right, this is the example behind. It's called marble. Some other ones are slate. Slate, you might recognize that word. When they use chalkboards, they use this metamorphic rock to make chalkboards. Then gneiss and schist. Those are all different samples or kinds of these different rocks. Now, just like the water cycle where it goes in a pattern, kind of like a circle, the rocks go in a pattern or a circle. Now, whether it is sedimentary rock, igneous rock, or metamorphic rock, it's all going to go through weathering or breaking down or becoming smaller pieces and changing into sediment. So if weathering happens to these rocks, it makes sediment. But if these rocks are melted or changed to magma, it'll change to igneous rock. And then more heat and pressure causes metamorphic rock. Okay? There's an example in your book that gives you more details on this rock cycle. All right, so weathering. There are two kinds of weathering. We have mechanical weathering, and this is the actual rocks getting smaller and smaller and smaller. This is what we're going to talk about in this lecture. Okay, and then there's chemical weathering. What we'll do, we'll talk about in the next lecture. Chemical weathering is when the rocks actually change to a new substance. But we're not going to talk about chemical weathering right now. We're going to focus on mechanical weathering. All right, so before we get into the rest of our lecture, I want you to go ahead and stop and read these two pages, 28 through 29, and then come back to the lecture. Now, another word for mechanical weathering is called physical weathering. Let's say that together, physical weathering. This is the actual rocks getting smaller. And there are many reasons why weathering happens. Now, you think of the word weathering, you hear the word weather, and you may think sunny, rainy, cloudy, snowy. No, this is not what we're talking about in this chapter. Weathering is just the breaking down of rock into smaller pieces. And there are different things that cause this breaking down. And they're called agents of weathering. Some examples, we have water, wind, temperature. Also, plants and animals can cause rock to get smaller. There are several different kinds of weathering, and we're going to talk about in this lesson. And these are all mechanical weathering. Remember, we're going to do chemical weathering in the next lecture. Okay? The first one is called either frost action or frost wedging. They're the same thing. Okay? Sometimes it just has a different name. So let's say it frost action, frost wedging. Now, when you think of the word frost, you think of what? Ooh, it's cold, wintry time, or ice. Now, what happens here is there are cracks in rocks. And if it rains, or there's some flooding, or whatever kind of water gets inside these cracks, and then sometimes the temperature will drop, and it causes that ice to freeze. Now, unlike other substances, water is very special. When it freezes, it expands. Other materials or other kinds of matter will shrink when it becomes frozen. But water is different. It expands or gets bigger. So when that water that's inside the rock, because of the temperature, and remember one of the agents of weathering is temperature, because of that temperature dropping, that water freezes, it expands or gets bigger, and it causes that crack to get bigger, and then possibly, over time, it will make that rock break. Okay? So you think of the word wedging, the root word is wedge. Wedge, okay? We learned in Science 4 that a wedge is a simple machine. When, for example, an axe, when you need to cut wood in half, that axe is a kind of a triangle shape. It's called an inclined plane, and because of force, it breaks that wood into two pieces. It's called a wedge. It's splitting it in two. So that ice inside the rock causes that rock to break in half, wedging. All right, then we have what was called frost heaving. Now the word heaving, the root word is to heave, kind of means to throw something or to push something very hard. In this case, when we have frost heaving, water gets under rocks. And remember, water expands when it freezes, and when it expands, it pushes these rocks up to the surface. Now, many, many years ago, farmers, before we had all this technology, farmers actually thought that rocks were growing in their fields, because in the springtime, they would take away all of these rocks, and to be ready for planting, And then that winter, or the following spring, there would be rocks again because of frost heaving. The water, the frozen water pushed more rocks to the top, but they thought that these rocks were actually growing, and they got very frustrated. All right, then we also have pressure release. Now, well, I'm going to show you examples of each one of these mechanical weathering. Now, pressure release, let's say you have some bedrock or some thick layer of rock underneath all of the soil. And that soil causes a lot of pressure on that rock. Now, sometimes you say in construction, when they have to take away all of that soil so they can build a building, that pressure that was now on that rock is now released. And now it gives it a chance to expand. Now, pressure release and the next one, exfoliation, kind of match together. When that pressure is taken away, or all that soil is taken away, and that rock is allowed to expand, it causes it to weather or exfoliate or to break off into layers. And I'll show you some examples of that. That's called pressure release. And then the next one is exfoliating, which, just like I said, it breaks into layers, kind of like an onion. And the last one is abrasion, okay? Abrasion, we'll talk about that a lot in this lesson. Basically, abrasion is when two objects rub together. Now, if you have wind rubbing over a rock, it's going to wear down or break down that rock. If you have water running over that rock, it's going to wear down or break down that rock. Sometimes wind will pick up sand and rub that sand against a rock, and it'll break down that rock. That's called abrasion. Okay. So let me show you some different examples of this weathering. Okay, so frost action or frost wedging. Okay, so like I said, I know this is not a very nice looking rock, but this is a piece of rock, and there's a crack in it, and water got inside of it. Then because of the temperature dropping, that water freezes, and you can see it got bigger. Okay, so it's splitting the rock, or that water, or that frozen water ice is acting like a wedge. And then eventually it will break it apart into two pieces. Now, this is an actual example of this rock. Now you see this rock is very, very hard. It's a very hard substance. You can't pick up a rock and just break it. But water is very powerful. It gets inside these cracks, expands when it freezes, and then will break a rock. Okay. All right, frost heaving. Now these examples are in your book. So you have these rocks here that are under the soil, and then water will get under it, maybe because of rain or flooding. Water will get underneath these rocks. There's sometimes there's pockets of air underneath these rocks, and water gets underneath of it. Well, then the temperature will drop. Okay, the temperature will drop, and then that water will freeze and will push those rocks up to the surface. These examples are in your book. All right, this is an example of frost heaving. Now you see here, when construction people put these bricks down, they're nice and flat, okay? But over time, and you can see this in the sidewalks all over Korea, that now they're not flat anymore. They're very, very bumpy. And what happened, there was some type of pocket underneath these, or underneath the soil that's underneath the bricks, and water got down into that pocket. When the temperature dropped, the water froze and expanded, pushing these bricks up. Okay? So now it's not flat anymore. That's called frost heaving. Remember the root word, heave? It means to push or to shove. Okay, pressure release. Okay, so in this example, let's say you have this area of land, and this is what we call bedrock or solid rock or very, very hard rock. Remember, different rocks have different textures or For example, igneous rock is much harder than sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock will break much easier than igneous or metamorphic. Anyway, so you have all this soil on the top, okay? And that's putting a lot of pressure on this rock underneath. But for some reason, this soil was removed, maybe to build something, and now that pressure is gone, and when that pressure is gone, it has room to expand down. It's kind of like, and I'll show you tomorrow in class when we do our notes, that if I take a sponge and I put it in my hand and I compress it, it will get smaller. But what will happen as soon as I release it, it will expand again. And that's the same idea as pressure release. Okay? So because of this pressure release, and you can see kind of the lines here, it exfoliates or breaks into thin layers, kind of like an onion. So exfoliating. This is an example of that. You can see the layers of rock because that pressure was released and it caused it to break into layers, exfoliation. Okay. The last one is called abrasion. Now it comes from a Latin word, and that Latin word means to scrape off or to take away or to cause friction against the rock, to scrape away. So we have several kinds of abrasion. We have water, and we also have wind, okay? So this water, you can see this water is rushing over. That water is carrying small sediment. That sediment is rubbing against these rocks, and it's causing the rocks to be very smooth. If you've ever played in a stream or a river, you'll notice that the rocks are very, very smooth. That's called weathering or abrasion. Okay. And then here in the wind, again, the wind is taking that sand or sediment and rubbing against rock. Now, different rock will abrade in different ways. Usually the rock on top is harder than the rock on the bottom. And so you get these very strange shapes because the rock is softer down here. It will weather quicker or faster than the rock on the top. Okay, this is, I'm sorry you can't see this word down here. This is an example of what we call a hoodoo. Okay, that's kind of a strange word, a hoodoo. And this is another example where the rock on the top is much stronger than the rock on the bottom, and it makes these very, very strange shapes when weathering happens. And this is because of wind. Now, plants and animals can also make weathering. Now, I'll show you an example. You have plant weathering, okay? So, what happens, just like water getting inside the crack of a rock, you have little seeds that'll get inside rocks. If it germinates, it will grow, and it'll grow, and it'll grow. And what does that plant do? It expands, and expands, and expands, and acts like a wedge, breaking that rock apart. So you've got a tree growing in the middle of this rock. And it started off as just a little seed, a little plant, that got bigger and bigger and bigger, acting like a wedge. Okay, so you also, I'm not sure if you can see this very well, but this is, and I apologize for not being able to see the bottom here, this is root weathering. So this is a tree, you can see all of these roots growing down, and remember, roots start off very small, but they get bigger and bigger, acting like a wedge, breaking rocks apart, weathering. So plants, but not only animals, animals can cause weathering. Now this little guy, he does what we call burrowing. And I apologize, I'll make sure that the next lesson you'll be able to see all the words at the bottom. But anyway, he burrows or he digs a hole to make his home. Now, the action of him digging causes weathering or the breaking down of rock. Well, if he's moving rock, those rocks are also rubbing against each other, abrasion, causing the rocks to get smaller. Okay, well, he's also moving all of this rock or sediment, and that is exposing more rock to the elements, wind, water, temperature, that can cause more weathering. Okay, so I hope this has helped you. This is the end of this lesson. All right, you see this lady again. Your homework is to do the questions on page 29. Make sure that you're ready with 1 or 2 questions to ask in class, and we'll have discussion and we'll do our notes in class tomorrow. All right, have a good night. We'll see you next time.